Hello, and welcome to the Innovation Front on Business Front TV, where African creativity and business acumen take the spotlight. Each week, we bring you stories from the edge of innovation, where bold ideas meet real-world impacts. From startups reshaping entire industries to inventors reimagining everyday life. This is where Africa's future takes center stage. Here's what we're tracking in African innovation. Nigeria's Minister of Communications and Digital Economy, Bosun Tijani, proposes the development of a new national blockchain policy. Kenyan teachers turn to AI amidst severe educator shortage. Nigerian drone startup Terahaptics secures $1.2 million contract to safeguard hydroelectric plants. Nigeria's Minister of Communications and Digital Economy, Bosun Tijani, has announced plans to develop a new national blockchain policy just 2 years after the previous one was approved in 2023. This move has sparked debate among experts and stakeholders. The proposed policy emphasizes areas such as digital identity, supply chain transparency, and financial inclusion, with plans to commission research involving 21 researchers to ensure its effectiveness. Now, let's turn to the classroom, where AI is beginning to reshape education across the continent. Facing a significant shortage of educators with over 98,000 teaching positions unfilled, Kenyan teachers are increasingly adopting artificial intelligence tools to manage overwhelming workloads. In some classrooms, educators are responsible for up to 200 students daily. Innovative solutions are emerging, such as the non-profit Classic, introducing AI chatbots powered by OpenAI's models. These tools assist teachers in crafting lesson plans, quizzes, and simplifying complex topics, thereby reducing preparation time and allowing more focus on students' engagement. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, the World Bank just released results from a study in Edo State that could shape the future of education policy. In a 6-week after-school program, students used GPT-4 AI tutors under teacher supervision to improve their English skills. The results? Striking. Students who engaged with the AI showed significantly stronger learning gains than those who did not. Researchers concluded that AI tools, when integrated thoughtfully and with teacher support, can meaningfully boost learning outcomes.
One of the most effective ways to improve learning is one-on-one tutoring. So instead of having the traditional model where you have a class with 30, 40, or in the case of Nigeria, in some cases, many more students, providing one-on-one instruction and specific support customized to the individual level of each student is a great tool to improve learning.
But they also noted that this isn't about replacing teachers. In fact, the study underscores that the best results come from combining technology with the human touch. Now to hardware. Terahaptics, a Nigerian autonomous system startup, has clinched a $1.2 million security contract, surpassing an Israeli competitor. The 5-year deal, awarded by private security firm NetHawk Solutions, entails deploying AI-powered drones and solar-powered sentry towers at 2 hydroelectric power plants in Nigeria. Speaking of hardware startups, let's talk about a part of the tech world that doesn't get enough attention. In 2024, African startups raised a total of $2.2 billion, and software companies like fintechs dominated the list. Here, we dive into the business of hardware with 2 compelling conversations, exploring what it takes to build physical products on the continent and the people making it happen. In conversation with us is Ken Okolo, the sales manager, Middle East and Africa at Raspberry Pi. We discuss the implications of Raspberry Pi's official entry into the Nigerian markets and the future of hardware in the country. Later, we'll be joined by Ayodele Obasegun, the co-founder and CTO of Vilsquare, the manufacturers of the Volt microscope. Hi Ken, how are you?
I'm very well, Sarah.
Very nice to meet you.
Same here as well.
So, as many people have already said, Raspberry Pi is a very important part of building hardware products, computing products, and Also very important for Nigerian developers as well, Nigerian manufacturers,
Yep.
because we need low-cost products that work efficiently, right? So I want to understand Raspberry Pi, even before they had come into Nigeria officially, many Nigerians were already using your product.
Correct.
So before you came, since you came into Nigeria, what are the trends you have seen in terms of who uses this product? So a lot of the times we see online a lot of hobbyists, right? People doing DIY stuff, and the brain behind it is a Raspberry Pi. But since you've launched officially, what does that trend look like in your business?
Okay, let me answer your question by just stepping back a little bit. Yeah, so just to provide some context. So when Raspberry Pi started in 2012, when we first launched our first Raspberry Pi, the Raspberry Pi 1, our biggest market was the hobbyist market. This is in the UK, in the US, in Germany, and places like that, in the very advanced manufacturing economies. Our biggest market was hobbyists. What happens is hobbyists, they play around with it, maybe as students, and over time they go into work, either as entrepreneurs or in their engineering jobs as engineers. And what happens is when there's a problem at work, because they've tinkered with the pies, as hobbyists, they then recommend the pies at work, or in building their own products, they build using a pie. So what has happened is globally, our market has moved from the hobbyist market to today about 70% of our revenue is coming from industry. That is OEMs and people who are building devices, hardware devices, and using a Raspberry Pi in their hardware product. Where's Africa today and where's Nigeria today? The trend that I see is Nigeria is in the hobbyist space that we used to be, globally in 2012. This is where Nigeria is today. A lot of the people who are buying Raspberry Pis in Nigeria are hobbyists. And the major where you're going to find a lot of hobbyists today is in the university environment. So a lot of the people who are buying this product are sort of existing within the university developer ecosystems.
Right, thank you for that. But with the way, since your launch, and the way you have seen the use of Raspberry Pi with hobbyists, do you think that Nigeria is on a path to become more like those other global markets where you see more industries just adopting Raspberry Pi more than hobbyists?
Absolutely. I often say, we had in January, Raspberry Pi had 2 events in Nigeria, so I flew in some of my colleagues from Cambridge, HQ, in Abuja and in Lagos. Abuja, we noticed that a lot of the attendees in Abuja were sort of hobbyist, university, academic type. In Lagos, it was very commercial. A lot of the people that were using the Raspberry Pis in Lagos were not just hobbyists, they were actually already making money using Raspberry Pi. So like we've seen in other markets, we know that the trend is going to go to the point where these hobbyists are going to start using Raspberry Pis to build products or use them in industry. And I already start to see some of the people who buy our products from some of the big manufacturing outfits already here in Nigeria, and a couple of entrepreneurs who are building hardware devices that are starting to use Raspberry Pis. Yes.
Wow, that's great. Okay, so I'm curious. Nigeria's market is a lot smaller in terms of hardware, than the other global markets in which you operate, like the UK, the US, and across Europe. So what was the reasoning behind expanding into Nigeria, especially because you see that most of the people who currently use Raspberry Pi are using them to build maybe one machine or the other. Just it springs up here, it springs up there, but nothing really large scale. Yeah. So what was the reason behind it?
Whew. I would say two things. Raspberry Pi started, again, I'm going to have to answer this question by going back a little bit. Yeah. How did Raspberry Pi start? The founder of Raspberry Pi, Eben Upton, used to be the director of studies for computer science at the University of Cambridge. And he noticed that a lot of young British people were not applying to study computer science in Cambridge. And they tried to figure out why is that happening. And they thought, because a lot of British kids had become consumers of computing applications. No one was really interested in building anything. People just opened a computer, they wanted to play with PowerPoint, Excel. Nobody wanted to actually build the computer. So that's how Raspberry Pi started, is let's create something small that people can play with. They can break it, they could do experiments, and we could get people excited about building hardware again, right? And that's how it started. That's the same mission that we've brought into Nigeria, is how do we get young people to start playing around with hardware? Break it. It's not expensive. When we started, we were famous for our $35 computers. And up until this day, our computers are low cost so that, people who are playing with these things, can tinker. So that's one big reason why we've come, is give young people and others an opportunity to be able to be innovative, be creative, try to solve local problems first as hobbyists. Is that going to give us a lot of money? No. But we know that in time, people are going to get restless. And so we're going to see those huge numbers of these hobbyists, translating their innovations and their skill sets into industry. So this is a long game, for Raspberry Pi in the Nigerian market. I could give further answers, but maybe as we go on, I think some of your questions might touch into some other points.
Thank you. So I want to understand, in terms of the way that you approach the Nigerian market. So, we've established an understanding that it's a lot different from the way that the UK, the US operate. So is there a difference in the way that you have approached and are approaching this current market in which you are, where there's a lot of, so we have a pretty large population, but not a commensurate purchasing power, right? So what would you say is the difference in, the approach in this varied market?
I think one thing that we've done in the way that we've dealt, and it's not just with Nigeria, but mainly with our African markets, is we've been a bit more flexible. We've been very flexible with our resellers, for instance. So when we sell into markets, we sell through our reseller program. And the way that we've sold here is we've not mandated our African resellers to, you have to buy all the products, you have to have this minimum spend, you need to buy this quantity of Raspberry Pi products. We've been very flexible. So if we have maybe a flagship product that has in a pack, let's say that particular product has 180 computers as a box, which will typically sell into other markets. We will sell thousands of those boxes. Here we've said, you know what? We could sell you a quarter of the content of the box. So we will, because of our Nigerian resellers, we'll break the box, which we will not do in other markets. That's one area, that we've try to make sure that, let's be sensitive to purchasing power and the local context so that we will grow, with our resellers and in effect grow with the market.
So, in the way that you see, you're the hardware professional,
Well,
to some extent.
to some extent.
To some extent, yeah. So, in the way that you see hardware, the place of hardware in Nigeria, and then just in the broader African context, what do you think would be the shifts we will need? Because there isn't really much focus, right, on the hardware business currently, and there is a lot of potential in that area. So what do you think is the shift Africa probably needs to just produce more groundbreaking hardware that can just give us an edge in the global?
I would say policy, government policy will play a huge role. Very recently, the president said, he would like to see us, or I think government entities, purchase more locally produced things. Those kinds of policies will make a big difference. I also feel, and this is me playing on the sort of African software revolution. A couple of years ago, much of software was built outside of Africa, but as a lot of young people got skilled in software with companies like Ayodele and the likes of that, and we had a community of talent, right? We started to build stuff here, and our software developers became one of the best in the world. Also, one key thing that drove that is people generally go where the money is. They could see that, oh, this is viable. And this is another thing that I think is going to happen with hardware, is once people start to see that, oh, this is big business and this is serious business, people will naturally, go into that. Another thing that I see, and I can see this happening already, is more and more, a lot of the foreign hardware that we import into the country will not be sufficient to solve our local problems, right? And so people are going to start to build stuff that will solve a problem in the village, that will solve a security problem in the north and the forests. And no one's going to build those kind of things for you. We're going to have to be self-sufficient to build hardware that will solve our local problems.
Local problems. Yeah. Thank you. So I want to understand, what is the, in terms of business model, right? There is, sorry, before I even go into that, there is just the economics of importation. Just so first of all, I want to understand, the unit economics of importing into Nigeria, especially with the way that the economy is going currently, is there a change? Does it portray a possible change in pricing? And what does that say for the way Raspberry Pi will operate in Nigeria?
Our hardware is generally low cost, and we will, as far as I know, we will always produce low cost hardware devices. We produce low cost devices because we ensure that the components that make our devices, we always source low cost components, good quality. We never say they were cheap. It's good quality, but low cost, right? Now, because of different shipping, customs, local taxes, local tax environments in different countries across Africa, which I must confess is not. We still need to do a lot of work, in custom duties and stuff like that. That naturally will add on top of the sort of pricing. And because we're not shipping in huge volumes at the moment, that too also adds on top of the pricing. And so we've been sort of flexible to say our margins are they're not huge margins. They're quite tight margins, right? And so tight margins in terms of we ensure that our resellers sell to the recommended retail price and they can't just bloat the figures to put whatever kind of profit that they want to put on it. But then they can add on whatever local taxes to our recommended pricing regime. And in that way, we try to make sure that we still keep the pricing to a good point that is still affordable. In most markets, we do that. In some markets, it's a big struggle. But I say one country that's done extremely well is Rwanda, for instance, because they pretty much operate 4 electronic products because they're really trying to make sure that they build hardware locally. They've really shaved off a lot of the extra costs that come in. So Rwanda, the UAE are 2 good countries that I say really understand the future. You know, they want to build and they're making the right environment for developers to thrive if they're going to compete with global hardware developers.
Speaking of the future, what do you think is the future of Raspberry Pi's hardware in Nigeria?
I think we're going to find Raspberry Pi. Sorry, let me go back a bit. Nigerians will make things. We will start to make a lot of hardware. I see in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to have a lot more hardware companies in Nigeria. And I'm convinced that Raspberry Pi will be a crucial component in a lot of the hardwares that will be built in Nigeria. That's all the work that we're doing now. We're willing to take all those risks and those investments today because we're getting prepared for the future.
All right, so we want to understand what are some supply chain challenges that you have experienced, the company has experienced in terms of importation to Nigeria?
Okay, I would say there's been last couple of years there were global semiconductor shortages around the world, which affected hardware in general. But even during those times, we ensured that we shipped it. We prioritized Africa. Obviously, the numbers were not much, but we prioritized Africa, right? And we kind of learned from that and sort of prepared ourselves if there were any future shortages and how to deal with that. I wouldn't say that it's supply chain in particular, as I would say that the biggest challenge, I would say, for hardware development in Africa, it's more infrastructure than it's supply chain. It's high cost of energy, it's power, it's fuel, those are the things that will make building products here a lot more expensive than if someone was building it in China, right? And this kind of goes back to the question that you asked before, what will make things better? It will be, again, sort of government regulation, government policy, government innovation, and things that are put in place to ensure that all these barriers, they won't be removed at once, but over time, that these challenges will be solved. Another crucial issue will be talent. We're not yet at the point where we have a lot of hardware developers, right? So we're going to need some time to build that ecosystem, of really good talent, that will help us build hardware that are globally competitive. Sometimes when you see some of the hardware that's being built today, when you look at the aesthetics of this hardware, they're not as beautiful as, hardware that you'll find. And that's because we're still developing our kind of talent, you know, our talent community, So those are kind of the challenges: infrastructure, talent. I would say those will be major barriers, but those are barriers that will be overcome over time.
Welcome back to the Innovation Front. While most Nigerian startups are building apps and platforms, one company is creating microscopes that is gaining ground across universities in Nigeria. Vilsquare, creators of the Volt microscope, a digital microscope for scientific research. Joining me is Ayodele Obasegun, the co-founder and CTO of Vilsquare. We'll be discussing what it really takes to build a hardware business in Nigeria, how they're making money, building talent, and navigating the tough road of tech manufacturing in Africa. I think that many people do not often understand how important hardware is to our technology ecosystem, right? We know about fintechs and health techs and agri-techs, and it's very easy to understand what they do. But oftentimes we probably do not realize that without hardwares, you won't have smartwatches and all of the cell phones and things that we have now. So what experience from Alasia Systems and Humane have you carried on to Volt Microscope that has made it such a success now?
So the first thing is that there is a disconnect. There's a disconnect between different markets. So the African market and the offshore market. So I would say like outside African market, the global market. Look at it. And the main was an eye opener for us, and not just for me, but the entire team. Who are all are scattered everywhere around the world now. It was an eye opener that we were trying to solve a local problem that wasn't a global problem. And again, those problems exist in our local space, right? So we have to come back and say that, okay, what are the problems that exist in Africa? What are the problems that exist in the globe? And how can we solve those problems? So one thing that I took away from that experience was that let's think first local. Let's think about what are the challenges, what are ways that we can solve our local problems. If you look at inflation, for instance, inflation is CBN, for instance, can't even give less than 27.5% interest rate, right? So there's no access to funds, for the local communities, for the hardware communities. Now, how can we leverage all these different problems that we're experiencing and connect them to hardware and solve them with hardware innovations and grow from there? That's the conversation actually.
Another thing with running such a company in Africa, I mean, you have mentioned some of these challenges that hardware can solve in the African system, but building in Africa also has its own embedded challenges, its own infrastructural challenges. So I want to understand with Africa's and primarily Nigeria, because you're building in Nigeria, with these challenges that we have, can you run me through the cost of building and running a hardware startup in the country?
Thank you. That's a big question. The so there are multiple phases to it. So first of all, there's the interference phase perspective to it. The interference perspective whereby you have foreign entities coming to bid for opportunities in Nigeria and coming in with large cash to be able to get those opportunities. That's the first point here to look at. There's the other part of whereby there is no ecosystem to support these growing opportunities that are in Nigeria, for example. Everyone in the hardware space are in silos. We're all operating as individuals. Although there are a few communities here and there, but when you go deep into those communities, there's still isolation in those communities. And the main reason is because Nigeria, the technology concept of Nigeria is a software driven concept. And then you now have the unit economics challenges that come with when you're having to build hardware versus having to build software. Um, all these things play along with also denial of government involvement in building these communities. I'll give for example, last year, the POS, registered POS machines in Nigeria is about 7.4 million devices. Now, if you were to have a same challenge of importation, these are imported devices, 7.4 million imported devices into Nigeria, and the market is growing. If you were to have the same thing in the agriculture sector, where you had rice, for instance, pushing out the local manufacturers out of the market, the government will ban it. The government will close the borders to rice importation and will say that let the local communities be able to, grow their rice and let the businesses thrive. But it's not the case in the technology space. You have 7.4 million devices running. By now, we should have a cap on what it should be. For instance, it should be probably 2 million are imported, 3 million are imported, or a 50-50 cap, whereby now we charge local manufacturers, local embedded system engineers or companies in Nigeria to build similar things and supply them to the market. All that lost revenue goes out. Now, these are all the different challenges. There are a lot of pockets to all these challenges. It may be difficult to exhaust everything, but you have first the interference, the foreign interference in our local markets. Secondly, you have governments denying or not looking at the numbers and knowing where to bring in regulations to make the local businesses thrive. You also have, a lot of brain drain. I don't want to talk a lot about that. Brain drain is heavy. A lot of young Nigerians or fresh out of university Nigerians who get into a hardware startup or a thriving enterprise don't even know how to use these equipment. So you have to train them. You train them for 6 months, 1 year, and then next thing you see a resignation letter where the person is relocating somewhere else, and then you have to start the whole cycle all over again. There are so many challenges coming with it. Unit economics, the cost of making so we understand, let's say you give somebody $5,000 and say, okay, build me this software to service this particular problem in this particular sector. Now, one person is using that software. The same cost of using that software that you spent $5,000 to build is the same cost for if you have 1 million users on that same infrastructure. But in the case of hardware, if you build a hardware for even 500,000 naira and one person is using it, for you to grow to 1 million users, you need 500,000 times 1 million users. So when you look at the two dynamics, it now becomes very, very difficult for you to grow a hardware startup in Nigeria. It's not that hardware itself in the technology is hard. It's that the ecosystem is difficult to scale in Nigeria.
That was a very insightful answer. And I think that it leads me to two other questions that I'm thinking about that I think that you can also provide insights on, which is, first of all, how easy is it to acquire customers in this ecosystem in which we live, where foreign companies are also building many of the things that you are building and many of the things other hardware companies are building. So there is this competition between local companies and foreign companies. And you may realize then that many Nigerians may prefer to purchase foreign products than local products. So what is that competition like, and how are you able to acquire customers, staying customers?
So this is a great question. The truth is, so we last year we launched a new product called Vilsquare. Initially, we were trying to focus on B2B. We said, okay, let's expand and let's try the B2C route and understand what is happening at the consumer endpoint. And so we launched a smart meter tracking your gas consumption, sending it to the cloud, sending it to your mobile phone, getting alerts. We do deliveries and all that. And the first challenge we faced with that was realizing that the name Made in Nigeria is almost almost reduces the quality, the perception of your product by almost 90% once you put made in Nigeria in it. And we started looking at it, that what's the problem? So we hired some behavioral analytics, behavioral science experts to come in and do a forensics on our customer base. What is really going on? We realized this was the issue. As much as we praise TikTok and we praise social media for the access it has brought to us, yes, we appreciate that. However, it has also brought in some certain ideologies, a certain lifestyle, a certain perception of how things should be. Now, we are competing with a certain region in the world that is light years ahead of us in terms of innovation. And Nigeria has to basically jump all the steps. Take, for instance, America has to jump all the steps that America has gone through in innovation. If you look at from the steel factories, if you look at how they evolved to even the Fords and coming up with processing plants and oil boom, we look at all those different stages which they went through for many, many decades, right? Now, we want to jump all this and be at the iPhone level. We want to jump all this and be at AI level. But we don't have all those different experiences to add to the context of what we are building. And it then becomes a problem. Now, the average customer in Nigeria wants to live in a certain status. It's just the truth. But when we look at the numbers, we realize that it's not possible. It's not realistic. There was a report that came out that said that there were more than 50% of Nigerians had less than 500,000 naira in their accounts. Now, we are trying to live a certain lifestyle. If we look at the government is the highest employer of labor in Nigeria. Minimum wage was fought even for it to remain at 70,000 naira. Now, purchasing power is shrinking. So people don't have access to those funds. People are going to alternatives for loans and buy now, pay later concepts and all these different things. However, you still see people live the lifestyle that is, you ask the question, how is that possible? Now, when you price a product at the standard of what it should be, because of course you're importing in raw materials, they then look at that product and try to compare and say, this is too expensive, because they look at price from their environment. However, they look at quality from the global perspective. So you're trying to price a product based on your earning power in your environment, but you're expecting to get the results and the finesse and the finishing aesthetics as something ranked arguably in the global north, right? So these are all the different disparities in the different markets we have. And what we've realized is that the average Nigerian doesn't want to pay the equivalent value that they would pay in America or in London or anywhere else. They don't want to pay that in Nigeria. They want to pay what their pocket can pay for.
What you just said reminds me of a story I heard of someone who had to write made in China for a product that was made in Nigeria because people do not want to buy made in Nigeria, right? Well, thank you very much for that.
Yes.
My next question is about talent. So we know the Nigerian education system. A lot of graduates complain about how the curriculum that they are taught is primarily theoretical rather than practical, right? So how do you get the talent, the required talent you need to build, to manufacture hardware in Nigeria? And how do you make them stay? Because you've mentioned brain drain, because it's one thing to get the qualified people, and it's another thing to ensure that they stay.
That's a great one too. So there are two dynamics to it. The first one is the the quality of graduates that we're seeing now has reduced. And it's not a problem of curriculum. It's not a problem of the style of teaching. The problem is coming from economy. I'll give an example. In 2017, the cost of an Arduino Nano board, it's a small board, it's a small computer board, which basically you can use to power up any logic system. The cost of a small board, Arduino board on Hop 360 was 970 naira. Now, if you Google on Up 360 right now, that same board costs 8,200 naira. In that same economy, we had people who were earning 30,000 naira as minimum wage. And then you have now people earning 70,000 naira as minimum wage. If you look at 970 naira to 8,200 naira, that's more than 700% increase. However, if you look at 30,000 naira to 70,000 naira, that's just barely almost 140% increase. So the young people in universities do not have access to the resources that we even had access to, because the drain is already happening economically from the universities, from the educational systems. That is where it's happening from. And now we are flipping to the second challenge. The second challenge is that this person comes out, they feel they have all the certificates and they are qualified to work in a space. So they come with some form of some self-confidence and maybe a more rigid and structured mindset. So it's difficult for you to retool within a short time because they've spent at least 4 years or 5 years in engineering. You spend 5 years, so maybe the person had an extra or two extras, so he has spent even more years, right? And you come out, and then you're trying to change that perception and lifestyle that they've built for 5 years. You're trying to change it in 6 months. It's difficult. So what you have is they either just grab what they can grab and relocate abroad. So what we did was to work with people who have dropped out of secondary school. So 60% of our engineers are dropouts from GS2 and GS3. There are people who are on the streets who are trying to make some means of livelihood for themselves. We take them, we train them, we give them some form of TVET training to use the machines to build, to understand how to design circuitries, to understand our designs. And we put them all together and, they thrive. So that way we're able to retain our talents. You don't have them upping and leaving because this before maybe is average earning at the end of the month is probably maybe 10,000 or 20,000 or even 30,000 naira. Now his average earning is 250,000, 350,000, 500K. The difference is clear for him. He would stay with us. So that's the strategy. I just shared it to the entire Nigeria for free.
All right, I want to talk about the skills required for selling hardware products. Right, there used to be a perception that software products were harder to sell, but these days, where there's an app for everything and there's a software for every problem under the face of the earth, I think that hardware founders may find it more difficult to sell their products, right? So, what would you say to a first time founder who is just starting a hardware company? What are the most critical skills that they will need to scale in the same way that Volt Microscope has scaled?
So, if I were to answer that, I would say that first of all, the first thing which you need is you need to have a more broad spectrum of how the hardware space intersects with the software. The truth is that the software is running on the hardware, and the software can only go to the extent of what the hardware can do. Take for example the AI boom that is happening now. It can only get to the extent that the processors or the GPUs on those your mobile phones can power. Now, it can run in the cloud. However, you see companies like Nvidia and all this AMD coming out with newer, smarter, faster, processors targeted for the AI space. Now, so you need to have a broad spectrum of everything. So, my own background is in solid state engineering and electrical electronics engineering. And with that, it gives you a concept of how the power sector works, how telecommunications works, how device and instrumentation works. You also understand sensors, actuators, how those different layers, how they all connect together and how they work. And all these things, your basic, your Python, your JavaScript, all these different tools, C++, C Sharp, they all come together to intersect at some point to make whatever hardware innovation you're coming for. But it depends on the solution that you're building. And if you say that, oh, there are apps for everything, so why do you need hardware? I guarantee you that there are apps for everything, but they can only do it to the extent of what they can do. Let me give you an example. House tagging, for instance. House tagging is a nightmare. So let me give you an example. A post office, they pull out the Google Maps. There are a lot of blind spots on the Google Maps for house taggings to know where you are going to. You can pull out longitude and latitude from your mobile phone. If your GPS is turned off, for instance, you can't get the longitude and latitude of where that user is. You can only rely on the network longitude and latitude. We call it LBS, longitude and latitude GPS. And that is the closest cell tower to where that person who is holding out your mobile app using it but has the GPS off, the closest tower is what you're sending out. And that's why you see platforms like MoneyPoint, and a couple of all these financial platforms, they require you to turn on your GPS before you even sign in, because that's the only way they can get it. Now, that is a problem. That is a pocket problem that exists. Now, you can have a hardware that sits between the layer of if your GPS is turned off, and we still need to get your location, your exact longitude and latitude location, but we can't get it. You can have a hardware that some way, somehow, intersects with your software and works, hand to hand with that. There are a lot of problems that still exist. In fact, there are millions of them that exist. It's just a little bit now more harder because everybody is just resorting to the software and to the mobile phones to use. But when you think deeply about it, you realize that user experience still leaves the hardware industry a lot of opportunities for us to take.
That was a very insightful conversation. Here's a question for you. AI is becoming more involved in classroom education, but can AI ever replace the magic of a great teacher, or should it remain in its supporting role? I remember my teachers in secondary school and the wonderful interactions we had, which contributed to my learning. So honestly, I can't imagine AI replacing that. But let us know what you think on social media. We are Business Front TV across all platforms. Thanks for watching. See you next week.